The Subcommittee on Energy will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the Subcommittee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Recommendations of the Commission to Review the Effectiveness of the National Energy Laboratories. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning, and as I said earlier, welcome to today's Energy Subcommittee hearing on the recommendations of the Commission to review the effectiveness of the National Energy Labs. Today, we will hear from the Commission's co-chairs, Mr. T.J., is it Glauthier? Glauthier, I can do this, and Dr. Cherry Cohon, as well as Dr. Peter Littlewood. Thank you for having a simple name, Doctor. Director of Argonne National Laboratory, regarding the extent to which the DOE lab system is working well and where it can improve. Like many topics we discuss in the Energy Subcommittee, this one requires a thorough understanding of the details. Of the DOE's 17 national labs, 10 are stewarded by the Office of Science for Basic Research, 3 by the National Nuclear Security Administration, or the NNSA, to maintain the nuclear weapons stockpile, and 4 by their respective DOE applied energy programs. Each of the 17 labs has distinct characteristics and capabilities that bring a unique set of challenges when it comes to management, oversight, safety, and security. For example, this summer, I, along with staff, had the opportunity to visit the Savannah River National Lab along with some of my colleagues on the committee. The Savannah River Complex is hundreds of square miles and houses critical infrastructure for the nation's nuclear deterrent, as well as facilities to support research subjects ranging from national security to environmental management. As the witnesses will observe today, 16 of the 17 national labs are government-owned, contractor-operated, which requires a certain degree of trust between owner and operator for us to achieve optimal results. That said, there is one fundamental question relevant to every subject we're likely to discuss today, whether it's collaborative research with the private sector, technology transfer, laboratory-directed research and development, also known as LDRD, or safety and security. So the question is, how much discretion should the DOE delegate to contractor operators while balancing the need to maintain DOE's oversight responsibilities? Ultimately, we're debating a risk-reward concept that is familiar to Congress because we have to balance similar concerns when legislating federally sponsored research and development. On one hand, providing more discretion to the researchers allows them to pursue the most creative ideas without encumbrances. But on the other hand, too much discretion without effective oversight can lead to waste or misuse of taxpayer funds. And as I mentioned before, the 17 labs are very diverse, so the approach for each lab should be distinct if we're going to get this right. That said, I look forward today to the recommendations of this distinguished witness panel as we consider legislative options to help the labs reach their full potential. Again, I thank the witnesses for their attendance, and I look forward to your testimony. And with that, I recognize Mr. Alan Grayson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today on a very important topic, our national laboratories and how to improve them. I'd also like to thank our witnesses for offering their expert recommendations and insights. The United States invests more than any other nation in research and development, yet when you put that investment in the context of a percentage of our GNP, it becomes much less impressive. Our R&D investment is stagnating, while other countries are seizing the opportunity to try to out-innovate the United States. China is currently on course to overtake the United States in actual R&D dollars spent sometime in the next decade. However, the United States has an incredible innovation asset, our national labs. In order to take full advantage of them, we must try to provide the national labs with the necessary resources, not only to maintain and grow a vast array of facilities and equipment, but also to fund the exploratory research that produces results we may never have expected. Beyond providing resources, the Commission to review the effectiveness of the National Energy Labs has offered a number of substantive recommendations in their report, and we're here to talk about them today. This Congress and this administration can act on the Commission's recommendations quickly and make meaningful improvements to our network of national labs. For years, the relationship between the Department of Energy and the national labs has been a complicated one. The Commission has to find the means to try to improve that relationship, that was part of your charge, and make it more productive and effective. This motivation is apparent in a number of your recommendations, and I hope that the Department will take in each and every one of those to heart. Providing laboratories with increased levels of independence and freedom is bound to cause some transitional issues, but the result could be a more innovative atmosphere that provides scientists the freedom to produce groundbreaking outcomes. The Commission's overall message is clear. The national labs are unique and irreplaceable. They must be a high priority in our budgetary decisions both now and in the future. I certainly will be a strong advocate myself on that point, and I urge my colleagues to join me in that effort. Thank you again to the witnesses for being here today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we will hear recommendations from the Commission to review the effectiveness of the National Energy Laboratories. The director of Argonne National Lab also will testify about his perspective on how the labs could operate more effectively. The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology's jurisdiction over the country's, quote, scientific research, development, and demonstration, end quote, makes possible American innovation and competitiveness. The Department of Energy is the largest federal supporter of basic research and sponsors 47% of federal basic research in the physical sciences. The Department's science and energy research infrastructure at its 17 national labs and facilities are used by over 31,000 scientific researchers each year. The Commission to review the effectiveness of the national labs was established by Congress to assess strategic priorities, unique capabilities, size, and accomplishments of this research network. The commissioners here today visited national labs, interviewed researchers and DOE officials, and compiled a detailed report with recommendations of how Congress and the DOE can ensure that national labs are able to reach their full potential. Last month, the Commission released its final report. It found that the DOE lab system provides unique, long-term research capabilities and that could not otherwise be reproduced by universities or the private sector. However, the Commission also found that the labs spend an excessive amount of time to navigate through government red tape created by the Department of Energy. Burdensome operating requirements can delay research projects and make it more difficult for researchers to pursue high-value science. Congress has limited resources for research and development. We have a responsibility to ensure that taxpayer dollars are spent efficiently and effectively. To achieve the best return on investment for the American people, we must ensure the DOE labs are able to realize their full potential. I thank our witnesses for their testimony today, and I look forward to a productive discussion about how we can improve our national labs. A primary goal of this committee is to ensure that federal research and development is effectively directed. As we consider how to best direct the Department of Energy, we must focus on policies that enable breakthrough discoveries. With improvements in the effectiveness of the national lab system, we can keep the best and brightest researchers here in the United States to continue to explore new ideas. This allows the national labs to provide the foundation for private sector development across the energy spectrum, create jobs, and grow the American economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll now introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is Mr. T.J. Glauthier, co-chair on the Commission to review the effectiveness of the National Energy Laboratories and president of TJG Energy Associates. Welcome. Mr. Glauthier previously served as the Associate Director of OMB and Deputy Secretary and COO of the DOE under President Bill Clinton. Mr. Glauthier received his bachelor's degree in mathematics from Claremont McKenna College and his MBA from Harvard Business School. Our next witness today is Dr. Jared Cohon, co-chair on the Commission and President Emeritus and University Professor at Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Cohon previously served as chairman of the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board from 1997 to 2002. Dr. Cohon received his bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of Pennsylvania and his PhD in civil engineering from MIT. And I now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski, to recognize our final witness today, Dr. Peter Littlewood, Director of the Argonne National Lab. Congressman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Littlewood, Director of Argonne National Laboratory. Dr. Littlewood came to Argonne in 2011 when he was appointed Associate Laboratory Director of Argonne's Physical Sciences and Engineering Directorate, and he was appointed as Director last year. He is an internationally respected scientist who holds 6 patents, has published more than 200 articles, and has given more than 200 invited talks at conferences, universities, and laboratories. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of London, the Institute of Physics, and the American Physical Society. Dr. Littlewood holds a bachelor's degree in natural sciences and a PhD in physics, both from the University of Cambridge. I want to welcome Dr. Littlewood today.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. In lieu of giving a separate statements, Mr. Glauthier has elected to give testimony on behalf of himself and Dr. Cohon, I understand. So I now recognize Mr. Glauthier for 10 minutes to present that testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Grayson, other members and staff of the committee, and others here who are interested in the National Laboratories. Dr. Cohon and I are happy to be here today to discuss the report of the Commission to review the effectiveness of the National Energy Laboratories. Congress created this commission in the FY 2014 Omnibus Appropriations Act. The President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology developed a list of potential nominees, and then the Secretary of Energy selected the 9 commissioners from that list. The 2 of us have served as co-chairs of the commission for almost 18 months, and we're privileged to serve with an outstanding group of commissioners with strong backgrounds in the science and technology enterprise of the nation. We're pleased that this is a consensus report. We received excellent cooperation and support from the Department of Energy, from all of the relevant congressional committees, the White House, the National Laboratories themselves, and many others. During the course of our work, we visited all 17 of the national laboratories. We heard from 85 witnesses in monthly public hearings in the field and here in Washington, and reviewed over 50 previous reports on this topic from the past 4 decades. We'll come back to that point in a little bit, 50 reports. We've titled our report, Securing America's Future, Realizing the Potential of the National Energy Laboratories. Our overall finding is that the National Laboratory System is a unique resource that brings great value to the country in the 4 mission areas of the Department of Energy: nuclear security, basic science R&D, energy technology R&D, and environmental management. For example, the national labs have 4 of the world's fastest supercomputers, which are helping the nation extend the lifetimes and safety of our nuclear warheads without nuclear testing. In basic science, their world-class particle accelerators, light sources, and other user facilities host over 30,000 researchers every year from our universities and industry partners. And in energy technology R&D, the labs have played an important role in helping to develop the innovations that have led to the nation's shale gas revolution and surge in wind and solar energy. However, our national lab system is not realizing its full potential. Our commission believes that that can be changed. We provide 36 recommendations that we believe, if implemented, will help the labs to become more efficient and effective and have even greater impact, thereby helping secure America's future in the 4 mission areas of the department. We'd like to highlight a few of our major findings and recommendations, and then would be happy to address any others of particular interest to you. Our most fundamental concerns and conclusions deal with the relationship between the Department of Energy and the national labs. We find that the trusted relationship that is supposed to exist between the federal government and its national labs is broken, and it's inhibiting performance. We note that the problems come from both sides, from the labs and the Department of Energy. We want to be clear that this situation is not uniform across all the labs. In particular, the labs that are overseen by the Office of Science generally have much better relationships with the Department of Energy than do those in the other program offices. Many of our recommendations address this fundamental problem. We conclude that the roles need to be clarified and reinforced, going back to the formal role of the labs as federally funded research and development centers for the Department of Energy. Under this model, the two parties are supposed to operate as trusted partners in a special relationship with open communication. DOE should be directing and overseeing its programs at a policy level, specifying what its program should achieve. And the labs, for their part, should be responsible for determining how to carry them out and then executing those plans. In doing so, the labs should have more flexibility than they do now to implement those programs without needing as many approvals from DOE along the way. In return, of course, the labs must operate with transparency and be fully accountable for their actions and results. This flexibility, in our view, should be expanded significantly in areas such as the ability to manage budgets with fewer approval checkpoints, managing personnel compensation and benefits, entering into collaborations with private companies, including small businesses, without having each agreement individually approved and written into the lab's M&O contract with DOE, building office buildings on sites that are not nuclear, not high hazard, and not classified, conducting site assessments that are relied upon by DOE and others to minimize redundant assessments, and sending key personnel to professional conferences to maintain DOE's work in leading-edge science and for their professional development. In the congressional charge to us, we were also asked to examine whether there's too much duplication among the DOE labs. We looked into this in detail and have included two recommendations in this area. The first regards the NNSA laboratories, the nuclear weapons laboratories, where we conclude that it is important to the nation's nuclear security that the two design laboratories' capabilities continue to be maintained in separate and independent facilities. The second recommendation in this area regards the way the department manages through the life cycle of R&D topics. In our view, they do a good job at encouraging multiple lines of inquiry in the early discovery stages of new subjects. And they're good at using expert panels and strategic reviews to manage mature programs. However, at the in-between stages, the department needs to assert its strategic oversight role earlier and more forcefully to manage the laboratories as a system in order to achieve the most effective and efficient overall results for the nation. We want to acknowledge the progress that currently is being made in some of these and other areas by the current Secretary of Energy and the current directors of the national laboratories. We encourage them to continue their efforts, and we encourage the subcommittee and others in Congress to support them and future administrations in this direction. Let us turn to our recommendations for how we believe Congress can help to improve the performance of the national labs. We'd like to cite four here in our opening statement. First, we conclude that the Laboratory-Directed Research and Development, LDRD, as the chairman mentioned earlier, is vitally important to the lab's ability to carry out their missions successfully. And we recommend that Congress restore the cap on LDRD funding to the functional level that it was historically, up until 2006. Second, to support strong collaborations between businesses and the national labs, Congress may need to clarify that the annual operating plans that we recommend should provide sufficient authority for the labs to enter into CRADAs and other agreements under the Stevenson-Weidler Act and the Fast Track CRADA program. Third, we urge Congress to continue to recognize the importance of the role of the national laboratories in building and operating user facilities for use by a wide range of researchers and universities, other federal agencies, and the private sector. Fourth, there does seem to be a serious shortfall in funding for facilities and infrastructure at the national labs. However, the scope and severity of that shortfall are not well defined. We recommend that the Congress work closely with the Department of Energy and with OMB to agree first upon the size and nature of the problem, and then upon a long-term plan to resolve it through a combination of additional funding, policy changes, and innovative financing. In the interest of time, let us finish by highlighting our final recommendation. We found that in the past 4 decades, there have been over 50 previous commissions, panels, and studies of the national labs. It's our view that Congress and the administration would be better served by some sort of standing body of experienced people who could provide perspective and advice on issues relating to the national labs without having to create new commissions or studies every time. Such a group could potentially be housed at the national academies or report to the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, or be somewhere else that would provide the independence that Congress requires. On behalf of our 9 commissioners, we want to thank you for this opportunity to serve the country on this important commission. Dr. Cohon and I would also like to acknowledge the great work of our staff at the Science and Technology Policy Institute, led by Susanna Howison and Dr. Mark Taylor, who is with us today. We hope that our work will be helpful and are happy to answer questions and to discuss our findings and recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Glauthier. And now recognize Dr. Littlewood for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairman Weber, Ranking Member Grayson, members of the committee, my own Congressman Lipinski. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts about the findings and recommendations of the Commission. Let me start by acknowledging the Commission for performing a thorough analysis. Commission members are really to be commended for the time and effort they spent on examining all 17 national laboratories' missions, capabilities, operations, and challenges. It was a very thorough investigation, and we're grateful for that. My fellow lab directors and I are pleased with the Commission's assessment that the laboratories provide great benefit to the country, that we serve not only the DOE mission, but also support the broader science and technology community and help fulfill the security needs of the nation. At the Secretary of Energy's request, we are collectively preparing a detailed response for his eyes, and we have actually already submitted that to him in the last day or two, and I'm sure he will want to share that with you in due time. But following many discussions that the lab directors and I have had together, I believe that my colleagues broadly endorse the major recommendations of the report. We commit to wholeheartedly engage on our part to work with DOE to make the necessary changes to further increase the value of the national laboratories. In the testimony that follows, I'll give you mostly my perspective as Argonne director, but as I say, I think I broadly represent the views of my fellow lab directors. The recommendations made by the Commission demonstrate certainly that they heard our feedback and ideas. We're gratified in particular by what I see as a prevailing theme on which I would like to focus my remarks today, the theme of reintroducing acceptable risk-taking into the lab enterprise, a theme which was already touched on by the chairman in his opening remarks. Risk can seem like a negative word, and I would agree that risk is negative in the realm of safety, but frankly, safety is the only area in which I would agree that we should never take a risk. What has developed within the DOE and its laboratories over time and in response to various events is increasing attention to detail and attempts to reduce uncertainty. This approach isn't unexpected and not necessarily all bad. Wishing to manage risk in a multi-billion-dollar institution like DOE is, of course, reasonable. But we've reached a point where we punish failure rather than rewarding success, and we're concerned that we've traded innovation for regulation. So reinvigorating the government-owned, contractor-operated, or GOCO model as recommended by the Commission essentially helps us hit the reset button. When DOE gives their laboratories and their contractors the authority to operate with more discretion, we are empowered to take the kind of risks that are imperative for scientific discovery and for technological innovation. In return, we accept the need for transparency and accountability. So to chart new frontiers, laboratories must take risks in breaking down barriers. We must work across scientific disciplines, between fundamental and applied science, between research institutions, and between funding agencies. This means overlap, sometimes messy. A fear of supporting what might be presented as duplicative research by different agencies or in different institutions is now resulting in challenges in building the pipeline from fundamental research to product. The large user facilities of the labs support communities of researchers who lie well outside DOE's own mission space, but just in medicine, that intersection has supported in the past such important advances as proton radiotherapy, many major drug developments, the Human Genome Initiative, and the artificial retina. And just surely as we must risk failing, we must risk succeeding and being able to handle the new challenges prompted by that success. Success in science and technology inevitably leads to positive, but sometimes disruptive change. Perhaps no other endeavor we undertake at our labs better exemplifies the need for accepting risk than the LDRD program. we welcome the Commission's recommendation to restore the cap on LDRD to 6% unburdened or equivalent. Investment in LDRD has enabled virtually every major Argonne initiative, including the original Advanced Photon Source and its upgrade, Leadership Computing, the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research, 4 Energy Frontier Research Centers, Advanced Nuclear Fuel Cycle and Reactor Modeling Simulation Processings. LDRD is peer-reviewed and extraordinarily competitive. So to conclude, I want to reiterate that I largely support the Commission's report as it speaks to the ideas and feedback that we have shared. The recommendations, when implemented, will help create a working atmosphere to which the labs, and I believe DOE as well, aspire. An environment where we are empowered to take risks, leading to new scientific discoveries in support of critical mission areas for the nation.
Thank you, Dr. Littlewood. Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes of questioning. I guess this is to Mr. Glauthier, Dr. Cohon. My first question for both is for both of the co-chairs. Would you all, for us, please identify the most recognizable inefficiencies between the DOE and its science and energy labs? And when you do that, please explain to us how these issues affect research on a daily basis. Mr. Glauthier?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the inefficiencies that we noticed the most are the transactional oversight, the amount of approvals required, the amount of investigations and inspections and the like, and that there's a lot of time spent on both sides, both at the department and in the laboratories, on these processes that is detracting from the time spent on the research mission that the laboratories carry out.
Dr. Cohon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would add, just for emphasis, something that Mr. Glauthier mentioned in our testimony, and that's this issue of duplication. As he explained, duplication is desirable early on as a new field of science is emerging. Having multiple laboratories trying out different approaches is a good thing. But there comes a point where the science becomes clearer and a particular approach seems like emerges as the preferred one. We all need DOE to assert itself more forcefully at that moment so we don't waste time and money on multiple approaches. So what we've urged in our recommendation is that DOE look for that opportunity and intervene more forcefully and earlier in that process.
Dr. Littlewood, I'm going to come to you, but before I do, I want to go back to Mr. Glauthier. You said in your opening statement, I think you had studied 50 reports. Was that right?
Yes, that's right. We think we're report number 56.
Number 56, okay. And so obviously, have you seen a trend through that time frame of the detail of getting bogged down into more and more of exactly what you're talking about?
Yes, I think for the last 20 years, going back to the Galvin Commission in the mid-90s, that these recommendations have been very similar, and there's been a lot of concern about the transactional oversight or the amount of micromanagement that's gone on.
Dr. Cohon, did you wish to weigh in on that?
No, sir.
Smart man. Dr. Littlewood, I'm going to come to you. How do you think these suggestions apply to your laboratory?
Let me make a brief comment about transactional oversight. Of course, we are not opposed to oversight. Oversight is important. We must demonstrate that we're using the taxpayer money well. But just a small comment, in 2014, we had 4 significant findings from audits. All of those were found by internal audits. We had 12 internal audits, 50 assessments and audits that came from outside. So we spend a lot of time on trying to make sure that we do a good job ourselves. And I will say that the attempt to bring in the contractor assurance system, which has come in the past few years and was commented on in the report, I think is a very good idea. I will say that there seems to be resistance within the system to bringing that to the stage that it was needed. So that's one comment. And then to comment about the competitive nature of science, I again agree, and I think there are some movements in the right direction. So firstly, science is a competitive discipline. That's one reason that the United States is so good at it. And so the fact that we use competition in the early stages to drive discovery is necessary. And then I think the ability to bring that together at the point where a program can be constructed and driven is something that has emerged strongly as a focus of the current secretary in the past few years through ideas such as the Big Ideas Summits, working together in cross-lab groupings, and it's something that the lab directors support. I think that wasn't a characteristic of activities 5 or 10 years ago.
You said in your comments, Dr. Littlewood, that you look forward to the theme of reintroducing acceptable risk-taking into the lab enterprise. I think that's what you said. I'm reading from them.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Would you elaborate on that? And then how do you define success based on what kind of, quote, failure and risk-taking? I'll leave that to you.
Right. So, so I think that, well, sometimes actually we must risk success. So we're often concerned about doing things in slightly uncharted areas because the result of success would be a project that was successful, perhaps slightly outside the DOE mission space. We're very conscious, however, of not doing things that could produce failure. Scientific failure is something that one should expect occasionally as a function of exercise. When you fail, you know that you should stop doing that and find ways of doing something else. I'm concerned that we actually have too many programs which can neither succeed nor can they fail, and therefore they tend to stagnate.
Okay, thank you. I'm reminded about Thomas Edison's quest to invent the light bulb on his 1,000th try. His staffer said, doesn't that just frustrate you? It's 1,000 failed attempts. He said, what are you talking about? We now know 1,000 ways that won't work. We're closer than ever. So the chair now recognizes Mr. Grayson.
Thank you. I'd like to conduct a brief, high-level, somewhat abstract discussion that is untethered from any specific recommendations that you made. Why do we have national labs instead of competitive grants open to everyone? Mr. Glauthier?
I'm sorry, Mr. Grayson, I didn't quite understand the question.
Why do we have a national lab system instead of taking the same amount of money and dispersing it through DOE to competitive grants open to everybody, presumably the best offeror? Why do we do it the way we do it?
Well, I think what we've tried to recognize is that there's a role for the national laboratories in this system of research enterprise for the country that is important, and that you could have a lot of very successful research done in the university community, for example, by individual investigators, principal investigators who compete for grants of the type you mentioned. At some stage, you need to have large-scale programs that are complex, interdisciplinary, and that extend over longer periods of time. And those in particular are places where the national laboratories can house those projects. There's still a degree of competition among the funding programs at the department and elsewhere. One of the things we recommend in our report is there should be much better use of peer review groups, so that as programs exist and are funded over time, there are the experts in the field are brought together from time to time from the university community, industry, and the other labs to review the work and to make sure that it is the appropriate work that the federal government should be supporting, and that it should be done there at the labs as opposed to done in the nature of grants that would be funded elsewhere.
Dr. Cohon, go ahead.
Yeah, please. I'd like to add to what TJ has said. For me, well, let's take the weapons labs and put them aside, because they clearly have a reason for being, which is unique. But to the way you put your question, which I like very much, I have a very large number of colleagues who would say, yes, that's exactly the right question. All the money should come to us and not to the labs. I think that the reason for being, in the first instance, for the non-weapons labs, are the user facilities. These truly are unique. They could not be mounted or maintained by any single university that I know of. Universities collaborate together, but not that well and not that effectively, which they surely would have to do to maintain these facilities. So for me, that's the foundation. Having created those facilities and maintaining them, that naturally, first of all, requires scientists and technical people to maintain them, but also attracts to them world-class scientists to use them and to support them. So I think that's the most compelling answer to your question. But I don't in any way want to take away from what Mr. Glauthier said. I think he's absolutely right. If you look at the continuum of R&D from basic research to the marketplace, the labs do occupy a niche somewhere between universities and companies. They are able to do these large, long-term collaborative projects that Mr. Glauthier mentioned.
Dr. Littlewood.
Thank you. Yeah, I, of course, do agree with everything we've heard, so I don't want to expand on those, but I'll add one further thing where I think the labs can play a big role, and that's actually by bringing together consortia that often involve universities and industry to work on large, long-term problems that are necessary to do that. You know, as an example, just a local one for Argonne, we run the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research, which is a $25 million a year program with DOE that involves a collaboration between 5 labs, 4 major universities as partners, 4 companies, and many other academics. It would be very difficult to bring that kind of collaboration together from the vantage of being a university academic, and I can tell you that because I've been one and tried to do that kind of thing, and it isn't so easy from that side. So I think that's another key role, I suspect, for the labs.
Mr. Glauthier, briefly, since I'm almost out of time here, why have contractor-operated facilities instead of government-operated facilities directly managed by DOE?
The contractor-operated facilities, which are the majority, 16 of the 17, have a very good record of having been able to attract and retain top-quality scientists and to be able to manage that effectively. Certainly, there are government laboratories, not only at DOE, but elsewhere. Our sense is that the quality of the science has been better at these run by M&O contractors, consistently better. There's good research at the other labs, but not as consistently high quality.
Thanks. I yield back.
Dr. Littlewood, if I understood your response to his question about the research being done at the labs to the universities, did you say that the universities can learn something from y'all, but y'all have never really learned anything from the universities?
I don't think I'd quite put it that way.
Okay, I was just double checking. The chair now recognizes the 2 young gentlemen from Illinois. Would you like to, the gentleman from Illinois, like to introduce them?
Glad to have some very important staff with me today, my son Caden and my son Cole. So glad they're joining me in Washington, D.C.
Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks, Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Really do appreciate your work so much. And Director Littlewood, especially want to say good to see you, always good to see you. And certainly I love to tell the story of what great things are happening in Illinois with our great laboratories, Argonne and Fermi and research universities. So thank you, Dr. Cohon and Mr. Glauthier. Would also like to thank you for all your work on the commission. Your commission did after the Cromnibus. I know you've both been very available to my staff with the National Laboratories Caucus as well in both the House and the Senate. I certainly share your goal of finally implementing some of the changes which we seem to be rehashing every few years. A little over 2 years ago, this subcommittee held a hearing looking at the ITAF study on the labs done by Heritage and the Center for American Progress, certainly very bipartisan groups. Last year, Brookings put together a good study looking at ways to better utilize the lab's tech transfer capabilities to spur local and regional economic development. So I see in your concern and agree with it about the number of studies which have been showing many of the same things over and over again. I also want to see that some of these things finally get acted upon. In the last 2 Congresses, the House has passed my legislation to free up the labs to do the work without unnecessary, burdensome oversight. Some of the most important provisions in my bill freed up the ability of the labs to be able to enter into ACT agreements, gave signature authority for tech transfer agreements under $1 million to lab directors, and allowed for some early stage proof of concept work to be done with tech transfer funds. In the statement of administration policy on this year's COMPETE's reauthorization, the President's senior advisor characterized these sections as reducing oversight in a way that would increase the exposure of the federal government to risk and liability while also conflicting with the execution of the DOE mission. Dr. Cohon and Mr. Glauthier wondered, this seems to me to be the lack of trust you mentioned throughout your report. Wonder if you could explain to the committee how the M&O contracts do and perhaps should work. It also seems to me that a lab would be hesitant to stray from the DOE mission, risking the loss of their contract, which comes under review every few years.
Yes, Congressman, happy to respond to this. And we think that your legislation actually is directed in the right way. The principal elements of it to make it easier for partnerships between the laboratories and the private sector or others. And our recommendations are very consistent with that. I think a key element is that it's not just setting the labs free to go off and do all those things, but our recommendation is that there ought to be an annual operating plan at the beginning of each year where the government and the department and the laboratory agree on the scope and scale of the things that laboratory is going to do for the coming year. And that would include the amount of cooperative work that they intend to do with industry. And they're going to describe the nature of that work. Let's say a laboratory like Argonne is going to do $50 million worth of cooperative work with various industries, a lot of it consistent with what they've done in previous years. And once they've had a discussion and they've agreed with the government about that, then the laboratory ought to be free to carry it out. And as long as the agreements with companies would be consistent with that plan and within that scope, they ought to be able to go ahead and do it, exactly as you described in your legislation. But there does need to be that predicate, that discussion up front, an understanding of what the areas are in which the laboratory is going to do this sort of work. But the key is the laboratory should be responsible. It does have to be transparent as it goes forward. It has to report what it's doing. It has to share that information with the department and be accountable for the way it's done it.
Dr. Cohon or Director Littlewood, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would only add, to echo what we say in our report, the DOE should be identifying what needs to be done in collaboration with the laboratories, and then leave it to the labs to figure out how to do it, and which is, again, very consistent with your legislation.
Thanks. Director Littlewood?
Yeah, I mean, let me actually broadly say that from Argonne's perspective, our interactions with the Office of Science are quite positive, often in many regards associated with this. So, but I think I like very much the bill, and the number of challenges you address are somehow getting rid of the sand and grit out of the works, in particular of being able to deal with industry. Sometimes we find it easier to deal with big companies because they have about the same number of lawyers as we do. When we want to be fast and nimble and help small companies take things to market, we need, we need more rapid methods of doing this. And I think many of the labs are looking for experiments to do this. They're being supported through DOE by, for example, the invention of the Office of Tech Transfer. But I think that they can be further engaged by the kind of legislation you're pushing.
Thanks. 5 minutes goes by way too fast. I have a couple other questions. If it would be all right if we could follow up in writing with you all, that would be great. But with that, Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time, or the time I don't have.
I think the gentleman from Illinois recognizes the other gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Director Littlewood. As you know, I'm very interested in ways that can help the national labs bring new energy technologies to market faster. And in general, the whole idea of improving technology transfer. I was pleased to see that recommendation 25 in the Commission's report mentioned the need to continue to look for ways to improve the technology transfer process. I know that Argonne puts a lot of emphasis on the commercialization portion of their mission. So I want to ask, does Argonne have challenges in taking technologies to market that we might be able to alleviate or lessen with congressional action? Are there any recommendations you would make to us?
No, thank you very much, Congressman. As you remarked, it's really an important part of our business to try and take technologies to market. What I'd like to see, in fact, is an expansion of what I would call the user facility concept in this space. So we're used at Argonne to having 5,000 users who come from all to use our advanced photon source. But we also have large and embedded facilities at the labs that can be really important in taking technology to market. And we'd like to find ways of making them more accessible. So sometimes those facilities have been funded by DOE, sometimes they've been funded by different pieces of DOE, and we found, for example, that we've kind of got an unwieldy internal portfolio of activities, and sometimes difficulty bringing those together in kind of one-stop shopping for any customer who is interested in our business. And DOE is helpful about this, but sometimes DOE looks over its own shoulder at duplication. So I'll give you one small example. We have a project that I'm very proud of, which is to develop better combustion chemistry for engines. And it goes all of the way from fundamental chemistry all the way up to design of engines. That program is funded by 4 different pieces of DOE. Because of concern about duplicative research and duplicative oversight, those pieces of DOE look at the boundary between the areas they're funding and are very concerned about overlaps. If you want to go from tech transfer, you want to take something from fundamental science all the way through to the market, you must engage in overlaps. So I think Congress could help by putting in language which is more sophisticated about duplicative research overlaps that would in fact encourage overlaps and enable things to get to market more quickly.
Thank you. I wanted to use the rest of my time to move on to sort of reiterating and getting more from all of you about the duplication of research issue that Mr. Glauthier had mentioned. I know that the report also states that most duplication that occurs within the R&D programs of the labs is intentional, managed, and beneficial to the nation. And I want to make sure that everyone here understands that this is not government waste that we're talking about here. Can you explain a little better, Mr. Glauthier, Dr. Cohon, why well-coordinated independent replication of research activities is valuable to the scientific process in national labs, and if there's anything that Dr. Littlewood would want to throw in there? I just wanted to make sure that we all understand what this is really about.
Sure. Let me start, Congressman. The duplication, if you will, at the NNSA labs, the weapons labs, is quite different than that at the others. So let me start with those. And there we did state very clearly that the duplication or the fact that we have design capabilities of the nuclear weapons programs for the country at 2 different labs is very important to the country. We have seen the benefits of the 2 different groups of weapons designers being able to validate their designs or to be able to test those against each other. And that's a specialized case where it's a very important one for us. The other types of duplication, if you will, are really a misnomer. For the most part, the work that's being done is very similar, but it's different. The linear or the accelerators is one of the examples. The light sources or other forms of accelerators that the government has funded and operates at different science laboratories around the country. Each one is a light source, all right, but they're different. They're different degrees of X-rays, different speeds and hardness, different kinds of applications. And so researchers end up using those for different types of research. And our group was quite satisfied as we went through this that the processes that the Office of Science uses in this case to bring together experts to really examine that and be sure as they go over the process of building new facilities or maintaining these is one that is serving the right needs of the country and not duplicating the science. Dr. Cohen?
I'd like to support and join the comments that Dr. Littlewood made before about the nature of science and its competitive nature. He's absolutely right about that. One of the major reasons that the U.S. is such a leader in research is because of the competitive nature of our research enterprise. So allowing for and managing that competition among the laboratories is actually a very good thing for the nation. And the key is the management part of it and understanding at what point the competition should end and we should move on. And I also want to agree with Dr. Littlewood's comment before that this administration of the department has done quite well in this regard, and there's been a very good progress. So it's not a waste. In fact, it's a very key attribute of the National Lab System.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for let's go a little further, but I think that was a good explanation we needed to hear. Thank you. Yield back.
Well, I'm going to take you a little further if the gentleman would, with a little there help over here. Dr. Littlewood, you had 6 patents, is that correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. And so when you went through that process of, I guess that was research and development of something, you would say that there's steps, you identifiable steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, I don't know, maybe not like Edison with over 1,000, but a certain number of steps. And I think what I hear y'all saying is if you've got 2 processes going along at the same time, maybe somebody does a better step 3 than your process has. And so in that regard, then the taxpayers come out because we actually get the best bang for our buck. The entire process becomes better. Does that make sense?
I agree entirely. That's very well put. So
Right.
the process of scientific invention and tech to market is many things.
Sure.
Lots have to be joined up.
All right.
And that you have it exactly right. They must know.
Perfect. I appreciate it. And thank you all for your indulgence. I recognize the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very interesting topic, especially to me. The chairman we took a Codell not too long ago to the Savannah River Lab, which my father actually worked at right after World War II. First time I had visited there, but I'm also on the Homeland Security Committee, so the research and the development and everything that goes on within the Department of Education for our national security is of exceptional interest. But what really interested me is we share a lot in common after reading recommendation number 2. We all agree that overregulation is not healthy for competition and for development, for innovation. And I think you identified that having a trusting relationship that's free from expensive, burdensome administrative oversight from DOE would be very helpful. And I appreciate that. Obviously, oversight of sensitive national security research is very important. We need to have a level of oversight. We need to make sure that we control what we're doing, that the intellectual properties stays within the defense community. But the domestic, non-defense related research and development, I think I agree that maybe we can reduce the regulatory burden on these. So, Mr. Glauthier, and I'd also like to hear from Mr. Cohon as well. When considering legislative improvements for the national labs in the amount of DOE oversight, should Congress make a clear distinction between national security and domestic research?
That's a very interesting question. I think both of them need the effective oversight that makes sure that the work is being done in a way that's consistent with the policies of the nation. Frankly, we found that the planning and oversight processes in the weapons program are not as effective as those in the Office of Science programs, for example. And we recommended that some of the procedures being used in the Office of Science ought to be adapted and used in the other areas as well. The peer review processes in particular, sometimes the weapons programs, I think, use the excuse that their classified activities restrict the number of people who can participate in peer reviews and the like. But our feeling is that there are ways to make those peer review processes more effective and use the discipline that comes from that to make the whole program more successful, more effective, and to manage projects in a way that brings them in on schedule, on budget, and the like, at the performance levels that were planned.
Dr. Cohen?
I have nothing to add to that.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Carter.
One last question on this for you two. What can Congress do to facilitate this, reduce the red tape?
That's a great question. The Department of Energy actually has the authority to do most of the things that we recommend if they are willing to do it. So One of the aspects is that the Congress can be supportive, can indicate to the department that you really want them to restore this kind of working relationship. Another key element, I think, goes back to what Dr. Littlewood talked about, which is risk acceptance. A lot of the rules at the department have been put in place because something went wrong. And people put a new rule in place and say, well, we're never going to have that problem again. Okay, but you've got a lot of other problems. And over time, it becomes a very cumbersome working environment. I think we have to recognize that things will go wrong. If you have 55,000 people working at the national labs, there will be some mistakes. We have to make sure we manage the risk side so that really serious mistakes don't happen, but that smaller errors can. An example is property management. We've got rules for tracking laptop computers that mean they have to inventory those and find every one of those at every lab every year. And there's a point of diminishing return. Some of those laptop computers are so old, they're not worth tracking down. You ought to decide that at some point you draw the line and say, okay, we've gotten 98% of them and that's it. There are just rules of that sort. I think Congress can be supportive of a risk acceptance, a risk management approach to the way the department is run.
Okay. Dr. Littlewood, would you like to add anything?
I think I just echo that. I think we don't have a risk-based management approach at the labs, and that's something that we would really benefit from.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized. Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for those who participated in the study. And also, I want to thank Mr. Littlewood for coming here and representing a national laboratory as well. I am proud to represent Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, as well as Sandia National Laboratory, approximately 8,000 lab employees in our district. A good chunk of them are scientists. And so when we think about the lab community, 17 different laboratories, 55,000 people, Dr. Littlewood, could you just very briefly describe to me approximately how many of them are scientists, people with advanced degrees, or even a bachelor of science degree or beyond?
I'm not sure I could say that for all of the labs, but I think probably reflecting your labs too. I mean, at Argonne, we have 3,500 employees, 1,500 of them have advanced degrees. I think that's probably a common proportion across the labs. And many of those, of course, who don't have advanced degrees will have bachelor's degrees in working in this.
And Dr. Littlewood, to get an advanced degree today or even 10, 15 years ago, you agree, it's quite an investment in one's future.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. And one challenge that I have come across talking to our lab employees at home is that because the labs are operated as government-owned, contractor-operated, these scientists who have made 6-digit investments in their future with the student loan debt that they've taken on do not qualify for the public student loan forgiveness program. Are you aware of that?
I was aware of that, yes.
And so my experience, and maybe you can tell me if it's different at Argonne or other national laboratories, is that these scientists are, you know, for all intents and purposes, they are committed to serving our government. They are career scientists. They're likely not going to leave, but they're ineligible for a program that other federal employees are eligible for.
That's correct. So you're quite right to say that we have truly dedicated staff. We, of course, have lots of very close collaborations with Livermore and Sandia, so we know them very well. And these are staff who are dedicated to public service. They're not officially federal employees.
Do you think that it would help you recruit, attract, and retain these bright scientists if we were able to make them eligible for the public student loan forgiveness program? And I'd open that up also to the other participants as well.
I mean, I've not thought in detail about it, but it seems very clear. I will say that the labs have some concern about recruitment over the years, particularly my colleagues who run weapons labs. It's very important for them to be able to recruit actually very substantial numbers of scientists, and in particular those who are able to hold a clearance. And so we're actually collectively very concerned about pipeline issues, and anything that we can do to bring people into this area of public service is something I would support.
Great, thank you. And maybe the other witnesses who've studied our national laboratories, is this an issue that we should look at, opening up and making lab employees who are not today eligible, making them eligible for, in the program, just so you know, if you make 120 payments serving the public, maybe as a teacher, maybe as a prosecutor, maybe as a public defender, 120 payments, the balance of your student loans is forgiven, but lab employees don't qualify.
Congressman, I think it's a very interesting proposal and not one that we studied in our work, but we did look at the issue about attracting and retaining really qualified people for these laboratories, and particularly the weapons labs such as Livermore, and it is a real challenge. So there are several of our recommendations that speak to that. One is the increase or restoration of the LDRD level of funding, which is very important at the weapons labs. And as Dr. Cohon has said from his background in universities, our universities today do not train weapons designers. That's done at 3 facilities in the country. And people need to be brought in who are very bright and trained in disciplines that are relevant, and then given the opportunity to work in these areas. To bring them in is best done through funding like the LDRD programs. We also address our recommendations on facilities and infrastructure to these areas as well. The rundown state of some of the facilities has been an impediment to recruiting and retaining really top quality people. And those labs that have been able to build new facilities, new office buildings, new research facilities, have seen the resulting benefits in their recruiting processes too. I think your proposal is an element that would fit in very constructively to that program.
Thank you, and I hope my colleagues on the other side would entertain that. It's something our office has been working on with other member offices with laboratories, but I do, Chair, believe that these scientists who work on national security programs shouldn't be treated any differently when the eligibility is considered for student loan forgiveness once they serve for 10 years. So I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The other gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Let me just note there are contractors, not just in the labs, there are contractors throughout the federal government, many of them risking their lives, having operations overseas with our military and our intelligence agencies. And that's whether or not we want to do it for contractors, what we do for a federal employee is something that is also designated by ballot, by budget issues, which if we indeed say all federal employees are going to, all federal contractors will get every right as a federal employee, yes, it'll cost the federal government more money, and thus there may be less money for research projects in their labs because we have a limited amount of money we're dealing with here. And, but maybe that is the best use of the money. Getting the best contractors you can work for you might be worth it, but we really...
Would the gentleman yield for just 15 seconds?
Sure, go right ahead.
And thank you. And I certainly agree with you because a lot of the contractors work for a year or 2 years at a time. And this federal program, which is already funded, requires 10 years of service.
Okay.
Thank you, and I yield back.
All right. Well, we'll be taking a look at it, I'm sure. I have been looking at this. We have 17 national labs, and their budget is $14.3 billion, of which $11.7 billion comes from the Department of Energy, and that represents that $11 billion represents 82% of the funding for the national labs. Yet of the national labs, there's a great discrepancy in terms of how much of their project is actually being financed that way. For example, Fermi National Accelerator Lab receives 100% of its funding from the Department of Energy, but the Savannah River National Lab only receives less than 7% of its total budget. Now, where's that other money coming from? If it's not coming from DOE, where's it coming from?
Congressman, thank you. The laboratories, Savannah River is an unusual case because so much of that site is actually the environmental management work. And so I point to some of the other labs, such as a Pacific Northwest lab or Sandia lab, where there's a large percentage, 30% or more of the total funding of the laboratory comes from other sources. Those tend to be the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, the intelligence community.
How much of it is private sector?
A very small amount actually comes from the private sector. I don't have the percentage at hand, but I would say it's certainly less than 5%. It's probably 1 or 2%.
Okay, so if the private sector is involved with using these labs, do they then pay? They're paying rent for and they're paying for the use of the facility. Is that it?
For work that they do that is proprietary, that is such as the pharmaceutical companies who test all of their new drugs in the light sources of the department, they pay full cost recovery. So when they're using those, they pay the total cost of the resources that they use. If they're engaged in partnerships where they're doing early stage basic research that's going to be published and they're not going to have any patent rights to it or anything, then they don't have to pay for that.
Well, what if they do? Do they have? Are private companies now receiving patents for the work that they did in the national labs?
Yes, and Dr. Littlewood might be in a position to actually give us some examples of that.
Well, yeah, so often what happens, of course, is that there is research which is done in the national labs that is licensed to private companies.
Right,
Right.
But does the federal government get a ownership share or a profit share in something that we have then provided for these private companies?
Well, we're regulated in this really by the Bayh-Dole Act.
Say it again.
By the Bayh-Dole Act. So going back to 1980, the ability actually to take federally funded research and license it to private companies were effectively regulated in the same way that a university would be over that license. And then there are other examples where we do what one might call, well, what are explicitly cooperative research and development agreements, where we agree in advance to do collaborative work with industry with an agreement in advance about what will happen to the IP portfolio.
Okay. Well, let me just note that I think it's a good thing that we have companies and other government agencies utilizing this asset. That's why we've invested in it, and I think we do, if it's possible to have a little payback, we're always looking for some way to, because we're operating on a deficit right now, but by and large, the idea of having our companies in the United States and other government agencies have that capabilities they wouldn't have otherwise is a good thing, and that's what it's all about. So thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back, and I recognize my good friend that served in the Texas legislature with me until we got demoted, Mr. Vesey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I had a question for Mr. Glauthier and Dr. Cohon about the report about the national laboratories and finding new ways to be able to work with universities. And wanted to ask, were you able to particularly identify any notable obstacles that prevented labs from being able to work with universities?
No, Congressman. We think that the relationships now among the laboratories in many universities are really very good, and with no major obstacles for further collaboration. We underline it in our report because we think it's so critical, both for the laboratories and for the universities. But there are no major barriers to that. We want to, of course, see it stay that way.
Are there anything that you think that Congress can do to even further encourage those relationships?
Probably hearings like this and asking questions like that is a good way to do it. Sending the message that it's a desirable thing to see those kinds of collaborations go forward. Dr. Littlewood has a lot of experience with this, and I'm guessing he's going to agree that there are no obstacles to this. Let's not create any.
Indeed. So I would comment on that. So, as an example, and Argonne isn't very different from any of the other science labs, we actually have 200 joint appointments with local universities. I've talked about joint research programs that we go together. But I will say that for us, the ability to work with universities in a regional context is beginning to be even more important because, of course, universities engage in their region, they engage with business, and they begin to form the ecosystems actually that can bring the labs in to be more effective in tech transfer. So in Chicago, the University of Chicago has the Chicago Information Exchange, Innovation Exchange, which Argonne is part of, because we have this relationship with the university. That connects us to a much broader ecosystem that would be difficult for a lab that's got a fence around it. So actually the universities often can be ways out for us to work with the broader community. What I will say, however, is that indeed I think we try very hard to have good relationships with our university colleagues. I think there are few barriers at the moment. I hope we don't create any.
Could I just follow on that? I'm really glad that Dr. Littlewood brought that up. This idea of collaborating with universities regionally for regional economic development. Argonne stands out among the 17 labs in being both open and proactive in that regard. We, our commission, in our report, singled, not Argonne out, but the opportunity for that kind of engagement in regional economic development as a potential that is not being realized by most of the labs. And doing it collaboratively with regional universities is a very good idea. So seeing much more of that, I think, would be a very good thing.
Yes,
I add one
please.
more thought, and that is that the role of the DOE labs in building and operating user facilities is very important for this collaboration with the university community. And sometimes it's not understood that the Department of Energy is operating facilities that are used by grantees from the National Institute of Health or from NSF or others, and that that role of the laboratories is a very important one. And so Congress could continue to really embrace that and be sure that those facilities are for widespread use by researchers in all fields.
Thank you very much for your answers, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
All right, Mr. Foster, you are up for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and I would like to thank Chairman Weber and Ranking Member Grayson for allowing me to sit in on this subcommittee hearing. While I don't sit on the committee, I spent 23 years of my life as an employee of Fermi National Accelerator Lab, and now I'm one of 2 members that represent Argonne National Lab. And I have to start out by saying that I resonate very strongly with the comments you've made on the risks of excessive risk aversion. That this is something that that we live. Those of you who've lived through the Tiger teams, you remember that? Yes. Okay. Yes. You're bowing your head appropriately. Let the record show that they nodded with a wry smile. That these sort of things represent an overreaction that typically starts.
So order without objection, but can you spell rye for us?
W-R-Y.
All right, I thank the gentleman.
Anyway, very often this starts when something bad does happen. There's an injury or something like this, or a security breach. And so then there's a newspaper story, frankly, an overreaction in Congress. And this gets amplified down the command chain at every step, where at every level in the bureaucracy, someone wants to make sure that everyone reporting to them absolutely isn't the one that trips over whatever rules are established. As a result, by the time it gets down to the working level, sometimes these have morphed into really silly things like tracking down 20-year-old computers. And I have strong memories of, as I was checking out a Fermi lab, having to track down computers I had not seen in 20 years that were just sitting around collecting dust somewhere. And this is because probably at some point someone, there are bad apples everywhere, someone stole some computers, and there was a story about it. And so I think that, when I'm trying to figure out what the rules that you should be held to on this, I think it's useful to segment the truly unique things we do. The part of your work that's, nuclear reactors or weapons, stuff like this, where there are really unique risks, from the probably 90% of what you do that is just ordinary things that can be compared to industry. And if the standard you were held to was really industry best practices, you have to deal with roadway safety on your laboratories, okay? And as do big industrial plants. And I think that when you compare your safety record for roads, comparing it to what industry does would be a much more reasonable standard. And part of that is that when something happens, Congress has to have a more mature reaction. We are seeing, we're seeing in today's politics, members of Congress standing up and saying, I want to guarantee that there is a 0% probability that anyone we let into this country from certain other countries will turn out to be a terrorist. And when you hold people to unreasonable standards, unachievable standards, then you end up with bad results. Anyway, so I was wondering if you have a reaction to using industry as a benchmark, at least for the part of your work that is comparable to what's done in industry. Any reactions as to?
Well, actually, let me comment. In fact, we do that, particularly over safety.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, as part of our oversight process, I have a board. My board, of course, has a safety committee. My board is actually a rather distinguished board that has captains of industry, former senators, people on it who understand these things very well. And we use that board and their oversight role to manage the lab in ways that we think are appropriate. As I think you're pointing out, many of the rules and regulations that we face are things that we have to do, and I don't actually believe help the operation of the lab.
Right. And so that these, do you have an observation about what altitude in the command chain most of these unhelpful regulations are generated at?
I think the regulations may have been delivered initially at high altitude, but without understanding the consequences. They then become embedded in the system at low altitude and impossible to remove. And it may well be that, as you say, some of these things we could fix ourselves if we actually had the courage to just go in there and take this out. And so I'll comment that the Secretary himself has formed a task force to look at what he calls an evolutionary model to try and dig out this cobwebby stuff which is just collected over the years.
If I might, one of the things that previous commissions have done often is to recommend that the department should review all its directives and orders and eliminate the ones that aren't needed. We took a different approach. We said there are many situations where you shouldn't even have to use Department of Energy rules or anything. That in settings where you're trying to build an office building, for example, it's non-nuclear, non-high hazard, it's not in a classified area, then you ought to be able to have the option, the laboratory have the option of using the standards that are in place in the community, in the state in which you operate. And we cite some examples where in California, for example, there are some electrical wiring standards for wiring an office building that Stanford has been recently doing. The Department of Energy has these 3 that we've cited that were issued in 2006. Those are the ones that contractors are supposed to use. In the real world, in the rest of the world, those have been updated 3 times since then, so that the IEBW electricians who are out there working on these sites have standards that are in fact being used throughout Silicon Valley, and they should use those standards for just a regular building of that sort. We think that that's one of the elements. Just give the laboratories that option to go with the standards that are the appropriate ones in the area.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members, including those about Rice Miles.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
Would it be possible for me to have another couple minutes of questioning because this is so dear to my heart?
Yes, sir. I'm good with that.
All right, thank you. I very much appreciate it. You'd mentioned one of the Commission's recommendations is restoring LDRD to 6%. And this is something, I was wondering if what is magic about 6%? Do you think as a general matter of principle that if the fraction of money, I'm not talking about increasing the pot, but if the fraction of money that was delivered as LDRD was increased or decreased, whether it would result in an increase in the the innovation and the efficiency of laboratories?
Congressman, if we could, the level of 6% that was without the overhead burden is what the laboratories is a ceiling. So not all laboratories would do that. And of course, many of the laboratories have decided to use lower rates. But the weapons labs especially find that it's so important, particularly in attracting and retaining their employees, that they do need to have substantial levels. that 6% is the level that they were using at points where it was unconstrained, where the government authorized LDRD but didn't have a cap on it. And so our recommendation is to return to the levels that they had found as effective levels at that time.
Yep. And is the decrease that we've seen in LDRD just a reflection of the fact the budgets have been squeezed, and that's one of the places you can, there's some not fat to trim, but, some optional things?
It's been a congressional direction. The change in 2006 was to add a requirement to put overhead rates on that, and they increased the cap from 6 to 8%, but the overhead rate effectively made it less than it had been before, and then that's been restricted further in the last couple of years.
Okay, and then finally, do you think it would be useful to have an explicit follow-up to this report, and to have actually action items and have you come back? Because there's a long history of really very high-quality reports that have gathered dust. And what's needed, frankly, to my mind, is an explicit follow-up, that 6 months or a year from now, you come back and say, here are our action items, and here are what we've done in response to them.
Yes, but our recommendation is that there would be a value to having a standing body of some sort set up so that it would not just be to look at the recommendations of this commission, but to be able to be a resource to the Congress on the implementation of these and the implementation of the Augustine Meese Commission a year ago and the recommendations of another National Academy report that Dick Meserve chaired and whatnot, so that, and as new issues arise, as a problem does come up at some lab, and the Congress wants to get the perspective of some group of experienced people outside an independent view, that kind of a body could be a group you turn to rather than having to create a new commission. So we would encourage you to think broadly about how you could accomplish that, how you can get that kind of oversight and support, but definitely on these recommendations and on the whole broader category.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it, and yield back.
Before the gentleman yields back, Bill, tell us, again, you worked in the labs how long?
23 years at Fermi National Accelerator Lab, with collaborators at many national laboratories.
In what capacity?
I was an accelerator designer and builder. I designed and built large particle accelerator, accelerator components and detectors. I'm probably the only member of Congress that's designed and built a 100,000 ampere superconducting power transmission line. I don't want to overreach, but
which is why I'm saying we're glad to have you here today. Welcome, thank you. And I do want to mention that we've got a bill that we should be dropping tomorrow, Dr. Littlewood, called the Nuclear and Energy Innovation Capabilities Act. We actually worked with Mark Peters on this bill, and it's going to be doing three things. Of course, it's on advanced reactors, modeling and simulation. We're wanting to, number one, we're wanting to focus on a fast research reactor. And we're also wanting to allow private reactor prototypes at DOE sites. So thought you'd find that interesting. And yes, sir.
Yeah, I actually look forward to that. Of course, we're very proud to have Mark Peters, as an alumnus of Argonne, go on to be director of Idaho National Lab. So that's one of the things that we like to do for the nation. I think that, by the way, particularly in the reactor area, I'd like to comment that Idaho, Argonne, and Oak Ridge are very much in synchrony on wanting to push forward the next generation of nuclear reactors. I'd like the U.S. to have some options in 2050.
Well, absolutely, we would too. And Aaron corrected me here. He actually testified on the bill, is what I meant. And we do have bipartisan buy-in. Eddie Bernice Johnson is co-authoring the bill with us. And so if my good friends here on the right will co-sign on with that bill, while we have a good possibility of getting it through. I do thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony and the members for their questions. And again, Bill, we appreciate you being here. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from the members. The hearing is adjourned.